All right, let's dive into another quick country history. Today we're tackling Venezuela, a place of absolutely stunning beauty, incredible natural wealth, and a history that is just packed with drama and contradictions.
So, when Christopher Columbus first laid eyes on the coast of South America back in 1498, this is what he wrote. He called it a land of grace, like something out of a dream. But that idyllic first impression, well, it stands in such stark contrast to the 5 centuries of turbulence, complexity, and conflict that would come to define Venezuela. But here's the thing. Before any European ships ever showed up, this land already had an ancient, rich history of its own. So to really get what Venezuela is all about, we have to rewind the clock, way back before 1498. I mean, just look at this timeline. The depth of human history here is just staggering. We're talking 15,000 years ago for the first signs of people. These were hunter-gatherers living alongside giant ground sloths and other massive animals. And by 1,000 years ago, you had complex societies flourishing, long before anyone there had ever seen a European sail.
The most advanced of these were the Timoto-Cuica people, up in the Andes. And we're not talking about just a few simple huts here, no way. These were pre-planned villages with sophisticated irrigation systems, terraced fields for farming. They were masters of agriculture. And fun fact, they're the ones credited with inventing the arepa, which is still a huge part of Venezuelan food today.
Okay, so just a year after Columbus, another explorer, Alonso de Ojeda, shows up. He sees these indigenous stilt houses built right over the water, and it reminds him of a famous city back in Italy, so he calls the place Venezuela, which means Little Venice. It's a pretty poetic name, right? But that poetry quickly gave way to brutal exploitation as the Spanish started going after the region's rich pearl beds.
And just like that, 300 years of Spanish colonial rule began. But, simmering resentment and a desire to rule your own land, that can only be suppressed for so long. Eventually, it was going to explode, and it did, into one of the fiercest independence wars in the Americas.
So what did those 300 years look like? Well, first, it was all about gold and cattle. Then there was this bizarre period where German bankers actually ran the place, looking for the mythical city of El Dorado. But the real economic engine, the thing that made the colony rich, was cocoa. And this plantation economy, built on the backs of enslaved people, created a super wealthy, locally born elite. And when they saw Spain get weakened by Napoleon back in Europe, they thought, you know what? This is our chance.
And that brings us to the man himself, Simón Bolívar, the liberator. His vision was absolutely massive. After a bloody war, he wanted to create a unified superstate called Gran Colombia, linking up all these newly free nations. But, as is so often the case, the grand vision crashed into a messy reality. The internal rivalries were just too strong, and by 1830, the whole thing fell apart, and Venezuela went its own way as a separate country.
So, independence is achieved. Everyone lives happily ever after, right? Not exactly. Actually, not even close. Instead of peace, independence kicked off nearly 100 years of civil war and ruled by powerful autocratic military leaders.
Okay, we gotta pause here for a second, because to understand 19th century Venezuela, you absolutely have to know this word, caudillo. A caudillo is a military strongman. He rules through personal power and force, not through laws or institutions. This figure, this political archetype, is going to cast a very long shadow over the nation's future. And when I say the post-independence era was chaotic, I mean it was pure chaos. The country was ripped apart by civil wars. You had these regional caudillos all fighting each other for control of the government. The nation was left completely broken and poor. Stability, that was just a pipe dream.
And then, in the early 20th century, everything changes. A discovery is made that would rewrite Venezuela's destiny. The country basically hit the geological lottery.
100,000. What's that number? Well, it's the number of barrels of oil that gushed out of a single well per day when it blew out back in 1922. It took them over a week to get it capped. This was a spectacular, messy announcement to the entire world that Venezuela was practically floating on a sea of black gold.
And boy, did that oil money change things. A dictator used the revenue to pay off the country's debts and build new roads and ports. But here's the catch, and it's a huge one. This flood of cash made the country dangerously dependent on one single thing. It's the classic resource curse, and it set the stage for pretty much every crisis that would follow.
All right, so after decades of dictators, Venezuela actually managed to build a democracy in 1958. For a while, the oil money kept things stable. But eventually, that prosperity soured, and the widespread anger and disillusionment created the perfect storm for a massive political earthquake.
So here's how it all went down. Democracy seemed to work for a bit, but when oil prices crashed in the 1980s, the whole system started to crack. Then in 1989, huge riots exploded in the capital. It was a brutal wake-up call. A few years later, a paratrooper named Hugo Chavez tried to lead a coup. He failed, but his defiant speech on TV turned him into a national hero. By 1998, people were so fed up with the old politicians that they elected him president.
Chavez immediately launched what he called the Bolivarian Revolution. He rewrote the Constitution, and with oil prices once again soaring, he poured money into huge social programs for the poor. But, and you might be sensing a pattern here, he also began to centralize an enormous amount of power in his own hands, a lot like those caudillos of the past. He took control of the courts, the military, everything. Then, in 2013, he died of cancer, but not before naming his successor, Nicolás Maduro.
And this is where the story takes a truly devastating turn. The crises that have been simmering under the surface during the Chavez years, well, under Maduro, they just completely boiled over, pushing the nation to its breaking point. With Maduro in charge, and wouldn't you know it, another crash in oil prices, the country went into a complete tailspin. We're talking hyperinflation so extreme that money became worthless. Crippling shortages of food, medicine, you name it. It was a full-blown societal collapse that led to millions, literally millions of Venezuelans fleeing their homes, creating one of the biggest migration crises in the world.
On top of all that, a massive political crisis. After a 2018 election that most of the world viewed as a sham, the opposition made a bold move. They declared their leader, Juan Guaido, as the legitimate interim president. So suddenly, you have two men claiming to be in charge, splitting the country and the entire international community down the middle. And then things get even weirder. With its own currency completely worthless, the Maduro government, this socialist government, basically gives up. They stop enforcing currency controls, and the US dollar becomes the real currency on the street. Even Maduro himself had to admit it was an escape valve. I mean, talk about a bizarre, ironic twist.
So that brings us pretty much to today. And it leaves us with this huge, fundamental question. This is a country that Columbus called a land of grace. It has more proven oil reserves than any other nation on Earth. So how, after centuries of struggle, is it still stuck in this cycle of conflict, dependency, and rule by strongman? That's the challenge. How to finally break that cycle.
Look, if you found this history as fascinating as I do, you should definitely check out our whole playlist of quick country histories. And hey, to make sure you don't miss future explainers like this one, be sure to subscribe to Notebook Summaries. Thanks so much for watching.